When I relocated to this lovely small town, it felt like stepping back in time. The people were warm and welcoming, and life moved at a much slower pace compared to the fast-paced city I had left behind. I bought a modest house, found a nearby job, and quickly settled into the relaxed rural lifestyle. The community was a mix of lifelong residents and newcomers, each with their unique stories. I quickly got to know the locals and joined in with local activities, forming close bonds with some of them. One of the most fascinating individuals was an older man who owned a large farm just down the road. After his children moved away, he eventually sold the property and retired to the southern states, leaving behind an estate that attracted plenty of. When the farm was left empty after the previous owner moved away, the silence was a source of curiosity and speculation for the locals. It was eventually sold to new neighbors who were said to be wealthy and from up north. The property included a farmhouse, a barn, several outbuildings, and over 200 acres of farmland. It had once thrived until the former owner got older, and despite his children's concerns, he decided to sell. I couldn't help but find the situation amusing, especially when discussing it with a relative who agreed the family's worries were exaggerated. One rainy evening, I encountered one of the new owner's daughters by the side of the road. Her luxury car was steaming with apparent engine trouble. When I stopped to assist, she refused to open the door. The door was clearly in distress, given the cold and pouring rain. I climbed to a nearby hill to get a cell signal and called the local sheriff's department. The dispatcher, Aaron, immediately questioned me about why I hadn't helped her already. I explained the situation, but he retorted, "Get back there and do something. She's probably scared." I grumbled about the rain and cold, but I teased him about sharing his leftover barbecue, and he laughed and sweetened the deal with the promise of the best slices, which reluctantly motivated me. 20 minutes later, Aaron and I returned to find her still in the car, visibly upset. I introduced myself, and Aaron gently asked if she needed assistance. She tearfully replied that her car had started smoking. He left her stranded with no way to contact anyone. Thankfully, I was nearby and able to come to her aid. I directed her to let me inspect the engine. Despite everything being computerized these days, it didn't take long to diagnose the issue, a ruptured radiator hose. I recommended calling roadside assistance and offered to tow her car to my lot for safekeeping. However, she was really worried about how her husband would react if she left the car behind. Aaron suggested that I tow it for her, even though it was really bad weather. I said I would, and I would make sure it was safe at my lot. The woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Dixon thanked me a lot before Aaron offered to drive her home, but then he got a call about an accident, so he had to go. When we arrived at the house, I was left to show Mrs. Dixon back to her place. When we got there, the house was in darkness. She told me the power had gone out, which I hadn't noticed earlier. I asked if she had any flashlights or lanterns, but she said she didn't. She also said she didn't remember the generator the previous owner had installed. I checked and found it was still running, but it only had a few hours of fuel left. I told her there were just a few hours of fuel left, so she should stock up on diesel to prepare for future outages. I gave her my card with my number and the address of my lot, and I reassured her that her car would be safe. I encouraged her to call if she needed anything before her husband returned. She was really grateful and thanked me repeatedly before I left. Later, I called my wife Flora to explain why I was running late. "Where have you been? Why didn't you call?" she demanded, apologizing. I explained about the stranded car and the sheriff's request for assistance. "I hope you charged them extra for making you work in this awful weather." She fumed. I assured her I'd be compensated, but I couldn't help noticing her growing fixation on money lately. It was a stark contrast to how things were. After securing the car on my trailer, I finally got back home. I found a note from Flora saying my dinner was waiting in the microwave. I grabbed a quick bite, showered, and went to bed. I slept soundly until my alarm woke me up the next day. The sunshine and warmth were a welcome change from the rain the night before. I fixed Mrs. Dixon's car at the shop. Around noon, a guy in his 40s, who wasn't Nigel Dixon, walked into the office. He introduced himself and said, "I need to arrange to tow my wife's car. Who's the best mechanic in town?" My assistant Danny pointed at me. I smirked and walked over to Adam Reyes. I said, "Sorry, Mr. Dixon, we're not." "Laughing at you just about the Dixon and Ferguson thing," Danny interjected. Dixon chuckled. "Well, I hope we won't be feuding." I left my shooting iron back in New York. I grinned and replied, "I melted mine into a plowshare. How can I help?" He explained that he needed the car. Toad and I informed him that it was already fixed, only needing a new hose and antifreeze. "Bring your wife by before 6, I said. She can drive it home, I added, surprised. How much do I owe? He asked, pointing to the receipt on the dashboard. No, I meant for your work, I said. Oh, he replied, shaking his head. We don't charge for kindness around here. If you wanted to rent equipment, I'd charge, or if I needed legal advice, you'd charge. But for small things like this, it's different. He seemed puzzled, but he nodded, appreciating. Later on, he came back with his wife, who looked younger and much more attractive than I'd expected. She thanked me over and over until I playfully stopped her. She said her name was Jill and held out her hand with a smile. I introduced her to Danny, and she and her husband took a tour of the shop, admiring the equipment and even our quirky event venue, which was a large circus tent. Like a tent often used for weddings that evening, my wife Flora was feeling edgy again. She wanted a new car to keep up with neighbors like the Dixons and their Rolls-Royce. Her Hyundai Sonata, which she had insisted on getting 2 years ago, was now almost worn out at just under 40,000 miles. We can't keep up with everyone on this. I reminded her that he's a lawyer. If you think otherwise, go ahead and buy it yourself without putting my name on the paperwork. I had her figured out. Flores's credit was a mess, riddled with defaults on car loans and credit cards from before we got married. I'd helped her with a car once, but I refused to pay off her credit cards. I don't believe in credit cards. Whenever the topic came up, I'd say that they're traps. She'd always reply that you have too, and I'd explain that mine were for business and for necessary expenses. I'd also use one sparingly to keep it active. Knowing this, I had her sign a prenuptial agreement to protect my assets, including I'd built my business from scratch, starting with subcontract work, and invested every penny back into equipment for 3 years. By the 4th year, I'd paid off my parents for the house. I was proud of what I'd accomplished, and had no intention of risking it, Flora. I met her at a contractor's Christmas party where she was with someone else. We danced and there was a spark. The hostess gave me her number and said to call her before kissing me on the cheek. A week before Christmas, she showed up at my shop and gave me a piece of paper. It was a rental agreement that read, "Mail good." I was looking for a Christmas party job. I'm a great conversationalist and I'm good at kissing. I'm also determined and willing to be trained. I'm good at delivering to the specified address. I had coffee with Lisa before the party. She said I needed a new suit, so we went shopping with her husband. Like 100 suits, Lisa said we'd found the one, complete with a matching shirt, tie, socks, and shoes. You're not picking out my underwear too, are you? I joked. Lisa grinned. Dark blue silk boxers. You want to feel as good as you look. I rolled my eyes but played along, knowing there was no winning with her. On the night of the party, I rented a Rolls. I met up with Royce and picked up Flora, who looked amazing in a green dress with a high slit and a plunging neckline held in place with double-sided tape. She wore a bold outfit, but carried herself elegantly and became the center of attention at the event. She was graceful, even when politely turning down overly eager dance partners during a slow dance. She took my hand and whispered, "No more slow dancing with anyone but you." This left a particularly touchy guy standing awkwardly on the dance floor. On the way home, she nestled close, nibbling my ear. At every stoplight, people were honking at us. When we finally reached her house, my car windows were fogged up after 20 minutes of kissing. She invited me in for coffee. I sat on the couch, trying to stay awake. I heard someone clear their throat. When she said she was getting out of the dress, she meant it. I stood there for a moment, speechless. She grew visibly anxious. Here's the thing. She started by saying, "I like you a lot. Normally, I'd send you home tonight and we'd date a dozen times before a big night with candles, music, maybe some whipped cream and chocolate. But I really like you. So let's say we wait for months and test out my mattress." After 12 hours, I only left her place to grab breakfast. Otherwise, the Escalade stayed parked for 2 full days. A few months later, we moved in together. 5 months after that, we got married. She was 25 and I was 29. We planned to enjoy a few years as a couple before starting a family, but things didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. 3 years passed and I began dropping hints about having kids. Around the same time, she started acting more demanding and materialistic. First, she decided we needed a new house, despite ours having 4 bedrooms. Then she maxed out a credit card and then canceled her access when I paid it off. Despite making decent money herself, she was perpetually broke. Her closet overflowed with clothes that still had tags on them, and piles of unworn shoes after the car episode. She didn't speak to me for 5 days. On the 6th day, she came home to find me emptying her closet. She stood there watching quietly as I packed her things into suitcases. I turned to her. I told her I wasn't going to live like this anymore. If I'm going to live alone, I'd rather actually live alone. I added that I'd called your mother. She's agreed to let you stay with her for 2 weeks. By then, we'll find you a place. I'll cover the deposit and the first 2 months' rent. I'll also set up utilities. You need to learn how to budget and live on your own. She fainted. I caught her, laid her on the floor, and wiped her face with a cold rag until she came to. Then she said, Adam, I had the strangest dream. You were kicking me out, but I don't remember why. Then she noticed the packed suitcases and burst into tears, pleading for another chance. I let her cry before telling her to clean up and meet me in the kitchen. Once there, I laid it all out. I said, I'm serious. This can't continue. The tantrums, the spending, the refusal to talk about starting a family. I don't know who you are anymore. If you want to leave. If you don't want to do this, we'll have to make some changes. She finally admitted that she was terrified of becoming a mother and haunted by her own childhood. She was the middle child, and when her parents separated, it hit her hard. I can still see my mom crying alone with 3 teenagers. She started drinking and ignored us. My dad moved halfway across the country. I don't want to put a child through that. She explained, taking her hand. I said, Darling, I'm sorry you went through that. I'm not talking about a full house, just one. If we want another, we'll wait at least 2 years. I'll never leave you. For the next 3 weeks, we avoided each other, but eventually things began to mend. She stopped overspending and opened a savings account. 3 months later, she proudly showed me the balance. I was stunned. Don't get too excited. She said it'll be empty soon. I was floored when she announced plans for a new car. She told me her real goal. I'm buying furniture for the nursery. You'll need to start painting soon. She smiled in a way that told me my world had just been turned upside down. It turned out we were having a son. She'd stopped taking her pills to surprise me, and it worked. When I cried in my office after hearing the news, it startled her. Did I make a mistake? I thought this is what you wanted. She began, but I cut her off with a kiss. My assistant, Lisa, immediately sensed something was up. What's going on with you two? You look like someone slapped you and you both liked it. She teased. I told her to keep a secret, but I knew the town would know by lunch. Sure enough, by the time we returned, a banner hung over the shop counter. Congrats, Adam and Flora. It's a boy. The pregnancy wasn't easy. By 7 months, Flora was on bed rest, and her mom moved in to help. Labor was long, 17 hours, and ended with a C-section. After the birth, Flora was exhausted and said she'd never do it again. I agreed, and she had her tubes tied before we left the hospital. The baby was born healthy at 9 lbs, with a full head of black hair, just like mine. The nurse joked that it might change, but it never did. Parenthood changed everything. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Life wasn't about us anymore. Every plan, even. A trip to the store revolved around him. Flora found motherhood more challenging than I anticipated. She adored Ellen, but handed him to me the moment I walked through the door, calling it her recovery time. I didn't mind. Ellen never cried with me, which sometimes frustrated her. If he was wailing when I arrived, he'd calm down the second I picked him up. My bond with the Dixons expanded as well. One weekend, Jill asked to rent a tractor for her garden. I declined, explaining that tractors can be dangerous if you don't know how to operate them. I don't want that on my conscience. You've got everything you need already. Mr. Anderson's tractor should work fine. When she mentioned that it wouldn't start, I offered to check it out. She protested. She was worried about taking me away from my family, but I told her they'd come with me that Saturday. Flora and Ellen came to the Dixons' house, and Jill held Ellen the whole time while Flora got annoyed. I charged the tractor battery while Nigel and I talked about their garden plans. Later, I taught Jill how to drive the tractor. I showed her the basics, like how to use the throttle. I showed her how to use the brakes, hydraulics, and gears, and made sure she understood the importance of safety. She practiced driving in low gear while I walked beside her, offering instructions. By the time we left, she was grinning from ear to ear, and Nigel had taken a dozen photos. Flora and I enjoyed spending time with the Dixons, but I couldn't help noticing her curiosity about the artwork in the house. Later on, I saw her looking up the value of some of the paintings. She realized they were worth thousands. Flora turned to work soon after, finding it unbearable to stay home all day. Meanwhile, Jill started a popular blog about her adventures in the countryside. She humorously chronicled everything from gardening to cleaning stalls. She called her crappy uniform She was resourceful and determined, and it was easy to see why Nigel adored her. Our friendship grew stronger over time. One day, Nigel asked if Flora and I could help with a southern barbecue he was hosting for a business meeting. I agreed, excited to cook again. Jill coordinated every detail, but I suggested inviting families instead. I suggested that she send each guest a personal call to make a bigger impression than a generic invitation. She relayed the idea to Nigel, who was happy to agree. As we prepared, Jill looked at me with a grin and said, "Have you ever thought about running for office? You'd win with the barbecue vote." I laughed and said, "Nah, I've just been to a lot of parties. You learn." As you know, Jill took charge of the guest list, and before we knew it, the event grew from 100 to nearly 300 attendees. We hired 3 girls from the neighborhood to help serve, and Flora, Lisa, and Danny pitched in to keep things running smoothly. The day couldn't have been better. It was hot but bearable with a refreshing breeze, so we set up a large dining tent, installed fans, and I also helped with the menu, which was pretty extensive. We had 400 lb of pork, 20 chickens, and 2 beef briskets, which we labeled as kosher for some of the Jewish guests. The side dishes ranged from potato salad and baked beans to zucchini casserole and grilled vegetables. A lot of these came straight from Jill's garden. For dessert, we had homemade cakes, brownies, and chilled watermelon for the kids. By the time the event wrapped up, I was completely spent, but it was worth it. We invited 300 people, but with kids included, 420 showed up before dinner. Guests mingled and enjoyed an informal atmosphere. We had a no-alcohol rule for the dining area, but there was an open bar set up under a small marquee, which was only open an hour after dinner. Senior partners of Nigel's firm made it. It was made clear that excessive drinking wouldn't be tolerated. Meanwhile, the kids played games and ran around while Jill and Nigel moved gracefully from group to group. The men talked business, and the women chatted about their families. There was soft furniture under the trees, which provided a perfect place to relax. I couldn't help but admire Flora, who was looking radiant in her conservative dress. She was wearing a sundress as she smiled and accepted compliments on our food near the end of the evening. We gathered everyone under the dining tent for a short speech. I set up the small PA system, and the senior partner stepped up to thank the guests. He praised Jill, Nigel, Flora, and me for making it a success. Everyone was surprised when he kept his speech brief, finishing with, "Don't ruin this perfect day. Grab some food to take home, and don't forget the ice cream." The crowd gave him a standing ovation before rushing to the ice cream machines. Flavors like chocolate, banana, pineapple, blueberry, and vanilla had both kids and adults eating too quickly, leaving many groaning with ice cream headaches. Jill's garden tours were a huge hit. She picked ripe tomatoes and beans to share, and the chilled watermelons from her garden were the stars of the seed-spitting contest. After the event, Flora nearly fainted when Jill handed her the check. The gathering had transformed into a full corporate event, so Nigel's firm footed the bill to top it off. There was an additional check with a 25% bonus and a handwritten note from the senior partner thanking us. Just to say a big thank you, I shared the premium with Danny, Lisa, and the girls we hired, and gave the rest to Flora, who really deserved it. Nigel's firm specializes in business law, and the event opened the door for more party requests. Before we knew it, the demand was so high that we registered it as a separate business. Flora quit her job to manage it full-time. Lisa was doing a great job, so I promoted her to rental manager, and she hired her husband, who had recently been laid off. Everything seemed to be going well, but Flora kept reminding me that she was now the boss, both at work and at home. She even teased me, saying, "It's your fault, Adam. Get over it." She also joked that how many men get to entertain their boss. By the end of the day, Flora was dressing more professionally and sometimes had evening meetings with clients. Saturdays were full of events and planning, while she handled the logistics. I focused on equipment, staff, and food preparation. The business was doing well, but we were spending less and less time together. The breaking point came after she scheduled 3 consecutive late meetings on Saturdays. I was frustrated, so I told her, "I'm not cooking, coordinating, or helping at all. If you schedule another late meeting, I'm leaving." I warned her that I thought this was a partnership. She shot back, "I care more about our husband-wife partnership." The next month, she scheduled a Sunday meeting anyway. I stuck to my word and refused to help, and it ended up being a disaster. The clients were disappointed and made it clear they weren't happy when I was feeding Ellen. She came into the kitchen waving a white handkerchief, but I told her firmly, no, before she could say anything else. I could see her eyes widen in shock. I told her, I want full surrender. Meet my conditions or this is over. No negotiations. I picked up Ellen and added, I'm taking him to Nigel and Jill's for a bit. We'll be back in an hour. I often looked after Ellen, and one of her first words was Jill, which made her cry that evening. Nigel asked me about an old race car in one of their barns. It belonged to the previous owner, but the engine had blown. I said it could be fixed, but Nigel was excited and asked why. He said he'd always dreamed of driving a race car. After some convincing, Jill agreed to let him give it a shot. We rebuilt the engine, and Nigel took lessons from local racers. Before long, he was racing every Friday night at the dirt track. One evening, Flora and I went to watch. The atmosphere was loud and chaotic, but Nigel seemed to be in his element. Midway through the race, however, he pulled into the pits, exhausted from battling the flu in the summer heat. One of his pit crew suggested that he could have a substitute if he's sick. Both Danny and I turned to Jill. I don't know anything about racing, I admitted. She said she didn't have to race. Danny reassured her that she just needed to keep the car moving, shift gears, stay behind the group and finish the laps. Nigel would still get credit and save his points. She reluctantly agreed as we buckled her into the seat and asked nervously what if she crashed. I tried to comfort her by saying the cage would protect her. Just stay steady and low, and they'll leave you alone. She paused for a moment, then hit the gas, scattering gravel as she joined the track for the first 15 laps. She kept to herself, avoiding any trouble. Then one racer, determined to improve his standings, began targeting her car on the headset. We heard her shout, "What the hell is he doing?" I told her to brake hard and accelerate quickly when he got close. He'll hit your bumper, but he won't have enough speed to do serious damage. She followed the advice perfectly, leaving the racer tangled in traffic. However, during the next pass, he slammed her into the wall. Jill pulled into the pits the fender. "Can you fix it?" she asked urgently. We could have pulled out the dented fender, but there wasn't enough time. Jill, however, was fired up. "Rip it off and get me back in. I'm going to run this guy into the wall," she said with determination. Danny yanked at the damaged wing while I buckled her in again. "Don't do anything reckless. I warned you. He'll come for you again. Clear the track." Jill hit the gas and roared back onto the track, driving like she was in a stolen Maserati. She weaved around the other cars with precision, seeing the troublemaker lining her up again. I yelled into her headset, "Cut left now." Jill swerved. She caught him off guard at the top of the track, and he slammed into another car, causing chaos behind her. When the caution flag was lifted, Jill found herself in third place by the end of the race. Despite losing a few laps, she managed to finish 7th. The guy who tried to ram her came in dead last, dropping further behind Nigel in the standings. When Jill got out of the car, she took off her helmet and grinned. "How does it feel to lose to a girl?" she teased, patting her rear. She dissolved into laughter and hugged Nigel, the driver, who looked furious. I stepped in and told him, "Be polite. She beat you fair and square. Learn from it." His crew was ready. Jill was hooked after a fight and used her trust fund to buy her own car and start racing in the women's division. She joined late in the season, but still managed to win 2 races. Nigel finally got his trophy, and they began planning for the next year, painting both cars with their company logo and ours. It was a recreational dirt track, the kind where many successful racers got their start. Nigel and Jill shared a passion that brought them closer to Flora and me. We had little in common anymore except Elwyn. Our business was growing with 2 crews now operating full. Flora started dressing more smartly, carrying herself more confidently and spending less time with Ellen and me. She joined a professional women's organization and began attending mixers every 2 weeks. When she won an award, I was proud, but at the banquet, something felt off when I was introduced as her husband. Several of her colleagues looked surprised and uneasy, which was strange. I remarked later that some of your friends seemed shocked when I was introduced as your husband. She seemed pretty shocked when I introduced Ed to you. Do you have a city husband? I don't know. I joked that Flora's face flushed. No, she said quickly. They were just surprised. You should come to mixers with me more often so I can show you off. Her explanation seemed reasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As fall arrived and business slowed down, we returned to working with just our core crew. Nigel's boss called to ask me to cook for a small party celebrating Nigel's birthday and his racing achievements. I want to show appreciation and let Nigel brag about his racing. You're his best friend outside of work, so I couldn't hire anyone else without offending you. He explained how many people he'd asked. Around 40 just friends. We'd love for you to cook. but not as a professional, just as a friend. I agreed, but kept it simple. I'll take care of the meat, pork, chicken, and Claw can make the desserts and sides. Nigel will appreciate that more when I tell Flora about the date. She frowned and said, I have an event that day. We've signed a contract and I can't miss it. I replied, They're our friends. If they hadn't trusted us to throw that first party, we wouldn't have this business. It would be insulting if you didn't show up just to check at your event. Just make sure everything's running smoothly and come back. Think of Jill and Nigel on the day of the party. Flora called to say she was stuck at work but would be back in an hour. We were running low on ice, so I volunteered to grab some from home, taking Nigel's car. I ran out of gas halfway there, walking back through the woods. I caught a glimpse through my patio door blinds. Inside, a couple who were entangled on the couch, assuming it was Flora and one of Nigel's younger employees. I thought it was a neighborhood kid at first, but it was Flora and one of Nigel's younger employees. I was really angry. My first thought was to go in and confront them, but I remembered what Nigel said. Reacting violently to infidelity only weakens your position. I was shaking with anger. I called Nigel and asked him what was taking so long. He said, Do I need to send Jill? I replied, I actually need Jill. It's an emergency. When Jill got on the line, I explained that I saw Flora with someone else. I need a witness and a good divorce lawyer. Jill's voice was calm. Stay there. We'll come to you in 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Jill, Nigel, and two of their friends arrived. One of the women, Nora, was a divorce lawyer I knew socially. She asked if I had proof. I showed her the photos I had taken on my phone. I also showed her the photos of Adam. The best thing you can do now is stay calm and don't engage with them. Let me handle it. It will give you the upper hand. Nigel called his senior partner, who pulled into my driveway, pretending to fetch ice. Flora and her lover scrambled to gather their clothes. The senior partner loudly announced, Flora, are you here? Adam sent me for ice. We're out. When she didn't respond, he unlocked the door and let her in. The lover bolted to the deck, half-dressed, while Flora came out of the house looking red-faced and panicked. The senior partner raised a hand and said, Not a word. Be in my office on Monday at 9:00 a. morning. He told her to leave without another word. Nora gave me her card and told me to meet her at her office on Monday afternoon to strategize. Remember to stay calm and don't let this turn into a war, she advised. Jill hugged me tightly and whispered, Think of Ellen. That night I avoided the house and stayed in Nigel and Jill's guest room. I couldn't sleep, but seeing Ellen smearing syrup on Jill's face at breakfast the next morning made me smile. Later that afternoon we had our first strategy meeting. I said, Divorce. Yes, she replied. Jill wants to move to the city. I want to stay here. Why? She asked. My roots are here, I answered. What about Elwyn? She pressed. He's a big part of my life, I replied firmly. I want custody. I don't think a child fits into her lifestyle. Nigel said he doesn't, but she'll use custody as leverage for a larger settlement. Nora nodded. We need to avoid turning this into a battle. Keep your emotions in check. I didn't see Flora for 6 days. When I returned home, there she was. It took everything in me not to throw her out. Flora saw the fury in my eyes and stepped back. Her voice was shaky. Please, just let me grab my things and see Ellen for a little while. Then I'll leave quietly. You can even take my car keys if you want. I let her play with Ellen, even though he seemed uninterested. She'd been so detached from him that he hardly cared. She asked for her car keys to open the trunk and suggested I help her. I followed her outside with her clothes. When she started the car, I yanked the keys out of the ignition and hurled them onto the driveway. She screamed as I pulled Ellen out of his car seat. He's mine and you can't take him, she yelled. Ellen cried, confused and scared, while Flora hurled insults until she noticed Jill nearby, filming everything with her phone. Jill pulled up on her four-wheeler was holding Ellen to calm her down, while keeping his voice calm but firm. Flora, if you want to see Ellen, you'll have to get court permission. I'm calling the police. I nodded, focusing on calming Ellen. The next day I handed the footage to Nora, who filed for an injunction requiring Flora to undergo a psychiatric evaluation before she could see Ellen again. Flora had moved in with her lover, who had been fired over their affair. His former employers used polite terms, but the message was clear. He didn't have any references, so he took a lower-paying job elsewhere. I sent a letter to our clients to let them know that I was no longer involved in the business, but I would honor all existing contracts. Flora took control of the party and catering operations. but I considered stepping away entirely. Nora advised against it, saying that I had a great reputation. You might want to come back to this later, as it also provides Flora with income, which could work in your favor. Negotiations began, and Flora made her demands. She wanted the house, but it was still in my parents' name. She wanted the equipment, but as per our agreement, it was owned by my company, and she couldn't afford it. Nora froze most of our accounts, allowing money was only for payroll and supplies. The profits went into an account Flora controlled, but she made sure it was fair. Nora and her lawyer eventually convinced her to accept the deal. Flora tried to have one last meeting to air her grievances, but I refused. She dated 5 men in 18 months. They were slick city types, most of them broke. I kept my cool. Flora ended up with the business, which gave me 1/4 of the profits. I kept full custody of Ellen, but Flora had limited visitation rights with strict conditions. No men around Elwyn, and any violation would cut off contact entirely. Jill and Nigel were a great support during this time. Helping me to cope with the anger and loss. In fact, Nigel kept a photo of himself, Jill and Elwyn on his desk, letting clients assume Elwyn was his stepson. It worked well for his image as a family man. I surprised them both by naming them as Ellen's guardians in my will. You're a family. Nigel, you've always been there for Ellen. Jill and you are like family to her. Seeing Nigel, a tough lawyer, in tears was a moment I'll never forget. One day, Nigel's senior partner asked me to escort his recently divorced daughter, Isabella, to a charity banquet. She's beautiful, he added with a wink. I agreed and rented a Rolls. Isabella was stunning, petite, blonde with a radiant smile. Her personality was just as charming as her looks. She was a real-life redneck and teased me, asking if I bit. I grinned and replied seriously, making everyone at the table laugh and setting the tone for the evening. The event was prestigious, and while Isabella was delightful, she admitted she talked non-stop. Do you ever stop when you're nervous? I joked. Only when I have something interesting in my mouth, she quipped, making Nigel choke on his coffee while Jill giggled. Isabella was a wonderful dance partner. She danced with her father and Nigel most of the evening, but she was by my side while waiting near the bandstand. I spotted Flora approaching with her escort, Larry Holly. Holly, this is Adam. Good to see you, she said. Her voice was strained. Let me introduce you to Larry. You might recognize his father, the founder. Isabella looked a bit worn out, like she'd gained weight. Her companion seemed totally disinterested in the conversation. Isabella caught the tension and leaned in to kiss my cheek. Do you miss me, love? She teased. Good. I want you to be upset all night. It'll make our passionate love even crazier later. Isabella turned to Flora and her date. Oh, I'm sorry, she said, smiling innocently. Who are your friends? This is Larry Holly of Holly Bank, she replied. And this is Flora Hicks, a local businesswoman, and my ex. Isabella was then introduced by my wife. I added, This is Isabella Hughes of Hughes, Howe and Dixon. Would you like to dance? I took Isabella's hand and led her to the dance floor. Flora and Larry were speechless as we waltzed. Isabella whispered, Jill told me everything, didn't she? I smiled and said, yes, she did. Isabella snuggled closer and said, don't worry about her. It looks like they're having a rough time. When the dance ended, Isabella pulled me into a deep kiss. Isabella gave me a deep kiss. She saw me ask and she replied smugly, You're welcome later. Larry asked Isabella to dance, and Flora approached me hesitantly. She asked, Just for old time's sake. I said, I'd love to, but I promised my lover all my dances. Flora's stunned look was priceless, and as Jill stifled a laugh, Flora and Larry left without a word. Later, I glanced at Isabella. I'm glad you're not planning to stay here permanently. She looked disappointed. Why would you say that? I'm starting to like you. I explained that we'd always be competing with other people. I'd have to keep men away from you, and you'd be busy keeping women away from me. She grinned mischievously. What makes you think I'd resist? She didn't, and we spent every spare minute together after that. Jill refused to let Ellen go for a weekend so Isabella and I could have time alone, but it didn't matter. Isabella turned out to be the best lover I'd ever had. She was strong, supple, and endlessly surprising. She never shared her age, but I guess she was in her 42nds. She adored Ellen, showing me pictures of her own daughter, who looked to be about 13. My ex is now, she said wistfully. I gave him more time with her because soon we'll be 3. I let Ellen go for a weekend so Isabella and I could have time alone. Isabella turned out to be the best lover I'd ever had. She was strong, supple, and endlessly surprising. She never shared her age, but I guessed she was in her 42nds. She adored Ellen, showing me pictures of her own daughter, who looked to be about 13. My ex is her now, she said wistfully. I gave him more time with her because soon we'll be 3. Just 0,000 millions away, I felt a growing distance between Ellen and me. I had to stay busy to keep my mind off it. I opened a barbecue restaurant. Lisa did such a great job managing the rental that I left her to it while I focused on my new venture. Running a restaurant was time-consuming and risky, but it paid off. I expanded into food trucks, sending them to nearby towns 4 days a week, and they became a hit. Despite my professional success, my personal life lacked permanence. I had given up looking for anything serious. Tragedy struck when Ellen was N9. Every afternoon, he'd get off the bus at Jill's house and ride his 4. Jill would wave at me as I came home, and they'd walk together to her house for snacks and schoolwork before heading back to ours. On rare occasions, he'd stay overnight. Jill had even set up a room for him. One day, Ellen called me crying, saying, "Come quick, Daddy. Jill's on the floor and I can't get her up." I raced over to find Jill lying on. I found Jill on the floor, sobbing and unresponsive. I was about to call emergency services when my phone rang. It was Nigel's boss, Adam. He said, "I need you to check on Jill. Nigel had a heart attack and died instantly. We found him in his office." My phone nearly slipped from my hand. Nigel was gone. He was my best friend in Jill's world. I held her on the couch, rocking her. She was like a child as we cried together. Nigel had requested a cremation, and for his ashes to be scattered around the farm. This is the only place I ever felt at home. There was an incredible mix of people at the funeral: clients, racers, firm members. Even Flora showed up, hugging Jill during visitation. While this was going on, Ellen sat on her lap. Flora's mother, who had grown Jill, was close to Ellen, who stayed nearby. Jill's eyes followed me around the room as if she'd lose her footing if I left her sight. Nigel's death hit everyone hard. He was only 52, and though he seemed healthy, doctors suspected an undetected condition after the funeral. Friends and family went back to their routines, leaving Jill to grieve with Ellen and Flora's mom and me. I stayed with her for 2 weeks to help her through it. She began to recover by the 2nd week. Reading Nigel's will made everything final. He'd left letters for his loved ones. One for Jill, one for Ellen to open when he turned 18, and one for me. The letter read, "Dear Adam, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Thank you for your friendship. You've made me a better person, and I appreciate that. I've set up a college fund for Elwin. I know you can afford it, but it was my pleasure. He's a great kid, and will grow into an even better man with your guidance. Please take care of Jill. She'll need you. I know you've loved her. Don't ever hurt her. She'll need your love to get through the dark times. I'm sorry I won't be around to see Elwin grow up. I'd advise you to find someone before you give up." Most of Nigel's possessions, including the farm and investments, went to Jill. He left funds to the racetrack he loved, which was renamed in his honor. Jill tried to move on, but a year later she decided to leave. "I can't stay here, Adam. I keep seeing his ghost everywhere I look." Ellen cried for 2 days straight, and I shed a few tears of my own. Jill had been my rock for years. She handed us the keys to the farm and asked us to take care of it. I visited often to maintain the property, but it just wasn't the same. Ellen started socializing more, and our home became a hub for his friends. I made it a point to know their parents and invited them over regularly. I dated a few divorced moms casually, but nothing serious. Meanwhile, my businesses were booming. I opened more restaurants. Meanwhile, Flora's business was struggling. She was losing customers because I wasn't offering favorable rental deals. Her chef quit, and she eventually closed. She became an office manager at an insurance firm, married a lawyer, and divorced within 18 months due to infidelity. She still saw Ellen on holidays and birthdays, but they didn't have much of a connection. One evening, I came home after opening a new restaurant to find Elwin and Ma grinning. I asked, glancing I was getting ready to go out, so I zipped up my fly. There was a visitor, so I went to the door. It was Jill. She ran into my arms crying. We stayed in touch, but I always encouraged her to come home. "How long are you staying?" I asked. "Another 30 or 40 years, she replied. She said she was tired of city life and wanted to see stars instead of smoke. She also wanted to see me and Elwin every day. Tears filled her eyes. It was the first time in 2 years I felt a deep sense of happiness. We helped her settle back into her house. She looked a bit worn out and out of shape, but within weeks the farm started to have a positive effect on her. She got stronger, and her youth seemed to return as she tended her garden and rode the tractor. Ellen split his time between her house and ours a few months later. Jill and I started dating and went to the movies, concerts, and even danced occasionally, despite her insistence that we were just friends. Everything fell into place one chilly evening as we sat on the porch swing under a blanket watching Ellen and his friends on their four. I stopped swaying and looked into her eyes. I said, "Marry me." She replied, "I've loved you for years. You love me too, even if you won't admit it. Let's stop playing musical houses and settle down." Tears welled in her eyes, but she continued, "I know you're 50 and I'm 43. I don't care. I love you and I'll love you until the day I die." She paused and I added, "This is an ultimatum. Marry me or I swear in Nigel's memory I'll never set foot on this farm again. Yes or no?" She didn't say anything, and I turned to leave before I could reach the porch. I can say it out loud. I love you, Mom. Our wedding, which took place in the spring in a meadow on the farm, became the talk of the town. Lisa went above and beyond, and Nigel's old friends from the firm came, including Isabella. She kissed Jill and told her how lucky she was. The racers at the track fixed up Jill's car and gave it to her as a wedding present. Years flew by in happiness. Ellen graduated from college, got married, and started a business with his wife. We gave them my old house as a wedding gift. We remodeled it beforehand. They gave us 3 beautiful grandchildren. Ellen named his son Billy on our 50th wedding anniversary. I gave Jill an oil portrait of Nigel by a renowned artist. She cried for 2 hours before we hung it above the fireplace. Some evenings, as Jill played with our youngest granddaughter by the fire, I'd glance at the portrait and swear Nigel was smiling.